We're going to begin. Good morning once again. It's our pleasure to welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, at the second Moscow Financial Forum at this session, which is dedicated to the Dutch disease and the oil prices volatility. We'll be discussing on how to get cured from this disease. I think it's a very important topic of a global nature. Not only Russia, but all the countries who are oil exporters have to deal with this issue for about the last 50 years. And I'll say that since the time when Mr. Nixon canceled golden standard in the US, there was an epoch of monetary frivolity. And since then, the market parameters have changed, including the hydrocarbon markets. The oil market has become more volatile. 74, 75 oil shocks, and then first half of the 1980s, the oil was getting cheaper, and in history we've seen several of such episodes. Let's remember this historic time, what had been happening on the petroleum markets and how it affected the Russian economy, and then we can engage in discussion to make sure that the future shocks would not have such a serious impact as they had it in the past. Can you please turn on the video? In 2014 through 2016, the Russian economy has experienced very strong external shock. The oil price have dropped almost 3 times. Western sanctions have closed the access to capital markets. Every significant crisis in Russia for the last half a century has been related to the dynamic of the oil prices. The crisis of the 2014-2016 is comparable with what our country has experienced at the end of 1980s. Back then, the attempt to support economy by the fiscal policy against the backdrops of the long drop in oil prices and the accumulated structural disbalances resulted in catastrophe. In the new Russia, we weren't able to quickly solve the problem of the restructuring of the national economy. Eventually, the accumulated macroeconomic disbalances and the high dependence on the external and internal borrowings compared with another oil drop provoked by the Asian crisis resulted in the default of the national currency in 1998. And as a result, macroeconomic disbalances were healed, but by the price of the financial well-being of the citizens. The ups and downs of the oil pricing went on for the next 10 years in our country. The fiscal support from the accumulated reserves in the hope to sit out this storm could repeat the crisis of 1998 in Russia. At the edge of the abyss, we were stopped by the pendulum. The pendulum went to the other way, the pendulum of the petroleum prices. The drop of the oil prices, the Western sanctions, the biggest external shock in the Russian modern economic history. The response of economic powers of Russia was to ensure building a rapid economy by pursuing the policy of the floating exchange rate and inflation targeting, and preserving control over the budgetary deficit and orienting ourselves to have a balanced budget amid the low prices and the spot-on anti-crisis policies. As a result, the economy quickly adapted with minimal losses and the economy was rejuvenized. What's next? What's next? I guess this is the main issue of how can we make these things systemic to make sure that the economy would not be so vulnerable to external shocks. We have a beautiful experts. I would like to present them. From me, it's Jeffrey Curry, the head of the analytical unit for energy commodities at Goldman Sachs. Armand Holmsen, Deputy Minister of Finance of Norway. Ksenia Yudaeva, the first Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation. Vladimir Kolchev, the Deputy Minister of Finance of the Russian Federation. Gabriel Dibella, the head of the IMF Permanent Mission in the Russian Federation. I would like to warmly welcome you. Mr. Curry, I first would like to ask you, once in a while I go to Goldman Sachs, the research about the oil situation, the new normal in the oil sector, and they get the spleen feeling, the sadness feeling on me. And I have a feeling that the oil prices are under a certain ceiling between the $50 and $60. The downward trends are very strong. Do I correctly understand the situation of what you're writing? It And the second question, maybe more fundamental nature. Can we, in principle, are we understanding oil market better today? Can we forecast the oil market better today than, let's say, 10 or 15 years ago? Thank you.
I think the answer to the last question, can we forecast the market better today? The answer is absolutely yes. And the reason for that is if we went back 10 years ago and I surveyed everybody in this room where they viewed long-term oil prices, the answer would cover a space of like $100 a barrel. The low would have been 40, the high would have been actually 200. Why? Because we had no idea what the technology was going to be. Could have been deep water, pre-salts, oil sands, ultra-deep water in the Barents Sea. We didn't even know the word shale 10 years ago in oil. And if you asked me what the dominant technology is, I would have said ultra-deep water. So don't listen to me about the technology. About 5 years ago, we started to hone in and go, wow, we're beginning to have an idea what that technology is. Now, why does that make a difference? It's because when you're arguing about technology, the range of prices in the underlying cost structure is massive. But once you have settled upon that technology, all we're arguing about is the cost to extract shale. In fact, you look at forecasts, you look at the distribution of them 10 years ago. It was about $150 a barrel distribution. 5 years ago, it was still probably about a $50 a barrel distribution. Today, that distribution, on the bottom, it's somewhere around 40, 45. On the top, it's somewhere around 75. It's doing this. Because all we have to debate is how much does it cost to get shale out of the ground. We don't debate the technology. Now I want to go to when we say new oil order. There are two implications that come from this. The really big one, and you've heard it before, shale is a manufacturing process. It's turning oil into a competitive market from an oligopolistic type of structure to a competitive market with a very flat supply curve. That's why production cuts from OPEC don't work anymore. Because in the old days when you had a steep supply curve, you take supply on and off the market against that demand curve. What happens to price? It goes up and down. Now, we rotate that curve and we make it flat. You take supply on and off the market now, nothing happens to price. But I like to point out, shale is Russia's friend because it's a flat supply curve. It means Russia should increase production as much as possible going forward. Because equally, if a production cut doesn't work, growing production won't really put that much downward pressure on prices. The last point I want to go over really is the question about the price range. You said a 50 to 60. I would put it now somewhere, and we learned this last year, somewhere in that 45 to 55 range, with a slight downward drift going forward. As I like to say, don't bet against an engineer. Give them enough time and money, they will figure it out. And they're going to get better and better at extracting that shale out of the ground, which will just put further downward pressure on prices. So the bottom line, when we say what is the new oil order, it's that manufacturing process that shale creates. It flattens that supply curve out, creates a competitive environment, and it creates an environment in which we're likely to have very small margins in the industry, but also relatively low volatility, which goes back to the original question, is it going to be easier to forecast the market? As long as shale is around, we're unlikely to see those big structural breaks like we saw over the previous decade. The market's going to trade in a much tighter range with a downward drift to it.
So to forecast is easier, but the forecast itself is not going to make us very happy people. Mr. De Bello, I would kindly ask you now, the last episode, the last crisis when the oil prices have fallen through 2014-16 from 150 on the minimum was $27 per barrel. From the point of IMF, what is the global experience? Some countries basically did not even experience this crisis. I guess I'll use this phrase. De facto, they did not even feel it. De jure, no. Other countries, at least without any visible complexities, they've gone through this crisis. What worked? What recipes were successful for different countries? Thank you.
Question, and first of all, I mean, I am really honored and to participate in this unbelievable panel. So thanks for the invitation. In terms of the experience, you're right. It's all over the place, and the differences between how countries reacted to the decrease in oil prices, and actually commodity-rich countries all across the board in metals, in food, also were experiencing different degrees this. Depended mainly on what policy frameworks countries were using the period leading into the shock. So there, I mean, in that sense, I think I can divide countries in a number of groups. I would say first group of countries that leading into the shock, they have implemented and had policy frameworks that were consistent, that they have been implemented already for a long time, that they were tested, that resulted in more competitive environments, and by this I mean fiscal rule consistently implemented during long periods of time, inflation targeting, floating of exchange rates, accumulation of buffer, fiscal space. And these countries, of course, they have much more room to maneuver in the moment in which the crisis, I mean the shock of the oil prices hit. And so for these countries, the impact was relatively lower, relatively milder. And in this group of countries, I would put Norway. There is a second group of countries, and this group of countries I would put Russia, that actually had very, decent policies leading into the shock, that had accumulated buffers. Actually, Russia more or less saved 1/3 of the whole oil price windfall in the period of high oil prices, but in which there were some tweakings of the policy framework that were needed in order for the country to adjust. And so this group of countries, I'm going to use Russia as an example, actually adapted to the shock pretty fast. And in the case of Russia, what they did was to basically move to floating of exchange rate and adjust the fiscal budget pretty fast towards the new reality of lower prices. Third group of countries with very big buffers actually decided to wait. And these countries are still having problems of competitiveness, and these countries are basically postponing the adjustment. Of course, they are doing something, but the result of this is that just basically they're using the buffers. And what I would put there as an example is some big countries in the Middle East. And then there is a fourth group of countries that had very bad and weak policy frameworks in the period leading into the crisis, and basically were forced to adjust, and they are actually right now financing their budget deficits, which is monetary expansion, and there I would put one country in Latin America with very large oil reserves that probably everyone knows what it is. So basically, this is why countries reacted differently to the shock.
Можно ли сказать тогда, что вот...
Can we then say that, for example, the engineers have invented these new technological processes, the prices for the oil have dropped, another shock, and with this next shock will come, you would place Russia in the one group with Norway. Will you do that if the next shock will happen? Because we still have quite significant reserves, and we also have the floating exchange rate, and we pretty much starting to act in very tight monetary policy, budgetary policy.
I would hope that that's the case. I mean, right now what we have is that the central bank is already building very strong credibility in the implementation of inflation targeting. That's very clear. And what we would like to see is this policy complemented by a consistent, permanent implementation of a fiscal rule. And what we have learned in the last few months is that the elements of this new fiscal rule are much more reasonable, they are much more credible, and they constitute a good first step towards building a more comprehensive fiscal rule. The answer to the question is if Russia is able to very consistently, during long period of time, implement these rules, yes, no doubt, it would be closer to Norway in the next crisis.
Спасибо большое. Владимир, к вам, конечно.
Thank you. Vladimir, I would like to go to you, but before I'll ask you, let's make this voting procedure. Now, I'm really curious to hear our audience, what our audience will say about the state of the Russian budget and the Russian economy. And the question that I would like to ask is very simple. Yes, we've started this voting. You need to open your application. In the bottom menu, there is a section Program, then Our Session, and then there is an opportunity to vote with your smartphone. It's 2517. It's a code for the voting. Technologically speaking, it will be a little bit more complex than the simple remote controls, but it's not that difficult. If you have the telephone, if you have the application for the Moscow Financial Forum, it's good. The first, do you think that the Russian economy and the budget have fully adjusted to lower oil prices? And this is the question. Have the Russian economy and budget fully adjusted to the lower oil prices? And the multiple answers are yes, they both have adjusted. The second, the economy has adjusted, but the budget has not adjusted. Number three, economy has not adjusted, but the budget has adjusted. And number four, neither of them has adjusted. Neither Russian economy nor the budget have adjusted. And I'll do my voting, if you will. I can see two voices. I can see two votings. It's a progress out of a couple hundred people, and I haven't voted yet, and this is the breakdown of our votings. Okay. The percentages are going lower. The more fractions, it looks like more and more people are logging into this system. Let's give another 20 to 30 seconds. I'm very curious to see what will be the outcome of that, because we can see a very dynamic picture. Okay. Let's use the round numbers without fractions. We will finish our voting. Thank you very much for participating. Vladimir, I would like to ask you, frankly, I expected a different answer, and I wanted to say something else, but whatever the case, we can see a significant share of our respondents who believe that for the Russian budget, actually it's quite interesting result. I would like you to comment it, because this item number 2 and 3 are quite curious answers that economy, number 2 economy has, but the budget has not, and the third economy has not, but the budget has. Good morning, everyone. I think the only outcome that the conclusion that I can make is something has adjusted. The question is, what has adjusted? Something has adjusted, because the last option, the least of the audience have chosen this last option. Arithmetically speaking, if we'll just take a look at the facts, we can see that the national economy probably has adjusted. We can see it in our external balances, and we'll look at the current account. We can see the current account is balances with the oil price around 40 to 45 US dollars per barrel, with a balanced structure of capital flows. This means that our current account, our balance of payment are balanced. And if we'll look at the price structures and the changes that have taken place, it's more or less relaxed, and the whole oil price dynamics and movements and the retail prices have stabilized, and the structure of the prices also has stabilized. And let's look at the structure of the economy. We can see some very significant shifts between the trading sectors of the Russian economy. We can see now that this structure is in the process of stabilizing itself, and in terms of distribution of the national income between the different institutional sectors, in the corporate sectors and households, we can see that step by step, even though the structure overall has changed, but it's also balancing itself. And this is all pointing to the fact that the economy, all in all, has adjusted. As for the budget, I believe that the actual numbers are telling us we probably have a way to go. We're still on the way, but if we look at the oil price, which is balancing our budget, yes, it has gone down significantly, while previously it was about $110 per barrel. And now we've gone down to $60 per barrel, and then $50 in the next. And in our budget rule, it is written that for 2019 we're planning $40 per barrel, and it'll take some time for us to adjust. But basically, there is trust. As long as we have trust for this policy, we can say that the budget has adjusted also for the new reality. Vladimir, I would like now to ask a question to your colleague from Norway, and then to have a discussion. Mr. Holmsen, I would like to ask you. Now, we are speaking a lot that the Russian budget is balancing with certain deficit, and oftentimes we think about the non-oil and gas Russian deficit, which is fluctuating around 10 to 8%. In Norway, the non-oil and gas budget is also a deficit budget about 8%. Could you please explain to us how operationally this whole system is working, and why are you comfortable in Norway with a non-oil and gas deficit of 8% of the national budget of the Norway's GDP, and how do you work with this kind of situation in Norway? Thank you.
To start to say that our current framework is based on the experience that we have made during the past 50 years since we discovered oil, and we have tried different approaches to the Dutch disease. In the beginning, in the 1970s, the first approach was to spend the money even before we had earned them. But that did not go very well. In the 1980s, we tried a second approach. We spent the money as we earned them, like a hand-to-mouth approach, if you like. And that did sort of crash in 1986, same experience that you had in Russia with the oil price fall in 1986. So that led us to the third approach, which we have implemented over the past 15 years or so, which is to spend the money after you have earned them. And the only way to do that is to accumulate a fund. So the whole purpose of our framework is to transfer a temporary windfall gain into a permanent income. So that's the whole idea. And we have done that by accumulating a fund which is now close to 300% of GDP. And we have put in place a fiscal rule, a spending rule, and the rule is actually, the setup is actually quite simple. The fund has two sources and only two sources of income. That's the dividends and the yields from the investment, and all the fund is invested abroad, nothing in Norway, everything abroad. So that's the first source. The second source of income is the government petroleum revenues. So all the petroleum revenues, which is taxes and yields from the government's direct ownership, go into the fund. So those are the two sources of income into the fund. Then we withdraw from the fund the expected real return. And that expected real return is currently estimated at 3% of the fund. That goes to cover the deficit of the budget. So the deficit of the budget is now well, that's the rule. The deficit of the budget should, over time, be equal to the expected real return of the fund, which is 3% of the fund. And since the fund is almost 3 times GDP, that's 8% of GDP. And that's the rule. And if we manage to stick to this rule, this will be sustainable. And that's the good thing about it.
Спасибо большое. Мы еще вернемся.
Thank you very much. We'll go back to discussing your fund. Very interesting structure in Norway. Vladimir, what is happening in Russia? What are Russian practices? We're conservative in managing national welfare funds. Do you have any ideas and concept of maybe using different strategies for Russia in managing the funds? The second, 80% of the non-oil and gas deficit of the Norwegian budget and the Russian budget, are they comparable? Or sorry, 8%. Are they comparable numbers? Yes, no, even, and if no, why? It depends on how you calculate. And Amund has been speaking that in Norway, quite a significant part of the non-oil and gas deficit is being offset by the revenues from the placing funds of this foundation outside of Norway. And if we will calculate our situation in the same way, it looks like in Norway, with given these revenues, deficit will be 0, and in Russia it will be 8%. It's a question of where is the policy more conservative, in Norway or in Russia? We don't have these 15 years that Norway said to accumulate 300% of the GDP in this fund, then to have non-oil and gas deficit of 8 and 10% and not to worry about that. Actually, in this plan, we have the fiscal rule, the budget rule, quite similar with Norway. If we look at if we'll try to recalculate the non-oil and gas deficit into in the terminology of the balancing price for oil, they are very similar. In Russia, 40. In Norway, numbers will be a little bit less, but I guess we can think in terms of this scenario. Look at the fiscal rule. And the second thing that I would like to point out, which is similar between the two countries, is the connectedness in the part of the budget parameters of this fiscal rule and parameters related to external balances. In Norway's case, this connectedness is automatic because alignment is automatic because the taxation of these windfall revenues is done in the foreign currency. Well, in Russia, we're taking taxes in Russian rubles, but to compensate for these revenues and financial flows, for the dynamic of the balance of payment and the forex exchange, to make it less volatile against the oil prices. Now we are trying to align the budgetary parameters of this fiscal rule with the parameters of the operations on the forex market, and they're fully synchronized. And so these flows are offsetting themselves and resulting in the movement of the Russian ruble against the oil price is also decreasing, which is very important in ensuring stability. Stability not so much for the Russian budget, but for the economy as a whole. So it's about the interest rate, inflation, and the movement of the investment exchange rate, which is important to make investment decisions in sectors are not related to the oil and gas industry. As for the level of conservativeness of investments of the fund, I guess the main message is that in Russia the fund is not that big to start thinking about taking some part of the money and investing them into the not super quick returnable assets. Based on how we're going to accumulate the fund. Maybe later, as we'll have more money in it, we will think about some other assets and placement of this money in different assets. But another important thing, in either case, these are assets in foreign currency, because otherwise it looks like this alignment between the budget parameters and the budget rule, as we call it, fiscal rule, and the parameters with external balances, we break the balance, and it has the bad impact on internal conditions, on the movement of the exchange rate against the oil price. And we would like actually to minimize this impact with this fiscal rule. Ksenia, Vladimir has just mentioned such words as inflation and forex exchange and things like that. And after the last turbulent period, the last drop in oil prices, I believe we have the principally new monetary policy. You may disagree with me, but I think we have quite significant changes. Now we have inflation targeting. Now the rates really have impact on the market. Everything depends on what central bank will say, how central bank will say it. Is there anything else which monetary policy can do in terms of us adjusting to the external shocks? Thank you very much. Indeed, today we're speaking about this complex of policies, measures and policies which can make our economy more stable amid oil shocks. And all three types of policies have to be involved. This would be fiscal and monetary policy, And first of all, we're speaking about the floating exchange rate, but the floating exchange rate cannot exist without any other goals for these policies. So we need inflation targeting, and basically we might need some macro-prudential regulations. I may later mention about this, and generally it's a complex measures to ensure the financial stability. Of course, it's a budgetary policy, first of all, the budget rule, the fiscal rule, and the structural policy, because the best way to defend ourselves from the oil dependency is diversify the national economy. And I guess it provokes no questions from anyone. We have to diversify. Neither in this audience nor any other audiences would have any questions about that. And if all these three types of policies are efficient and effective, they have a cumulative effect of the overall efficiency, and the finely tuned monetary policy is helping to the budget policy. The budget rule is decreasing inflation volatility and making the work of the central bank better, and makes our work easier. The structural policy is, of course, promoting the efficiency of the first and the second. And for us, in terms of inflation, structural policies, we have some problems. Some of our prices are very volatile. It is not related to the petroleum prices, but related to structural policies. And now, as much as the macro-prudential policies and financial stability, I would like to mention a couple words about that. This topic, for the last 10 years after the crisis of 2007 and 8, we pay a special attention, and it makes sense that the financial cycles in the raw material countries like ours are quite serious, and they may correlate with the raw materials cycles. And due to that, it's also enhancing overall economy volatility. And this is why the macro-prudential measures, they have to be tuned and set up in such a way that this effect would be made less. This is the general idea about the credit cycle. And then there are also the questions of the sector-related dynamics. And in view of our present conversation, I would like to draw your attention that basically it's the need to de-currencies, so to speak, the financial market, to go away from the hard currencies, because when the market becomes hardwired with foreign currencies, if we're speaking about the deposits and mortgage in let's say US dollars, they increase the volatility of the economy and the interest rates, and there are some potential problems with the Russian budget, and the effect is such that that on the external level, on the level of a human being and one particular company, this kind of financial instruments may look like a protection from currency risks, but on the level of the country as a whole, they are enhancing currency risks. So it should be the focus of our regulators. And actually, in the last year, we have already begun lifting the factors and coefficients for some US dollars nominated mortgages or euro-nominated mortgages. And we want to issue several normative acts about the macro-prudential measures. It will be one of the topics which in these normative acts will be reflected, and it will be one of the policies in terms of long-term management, and also it will be a counter-cyclical policy. Thank you.
Можно вот вслед сразу вопрос?
Thank you. I would love to ask you one question. If you talk about former Soviet Union, the countries compared to the Russian Federation, how far are we in this process, and have we come to some point of solution of this problem? Is it that active, the foreign currency? Is it still very active? Do they really still influence our economy? Are there certain measures that we should consider? Well, look, compared to other CIS countries, our situation is much better compared to countries in Eastern Europe, or compared to Norway or Western European countries, our situation is quite different. But, well, what is the point? You see, we had a very serious problem in 2014. The payments on currency debts, internal and external. If you look at the volume of bad debts, currency debts, these were for the loaners who didn't have any income in currency. And this is one of the main bank system problem, if you give credit to those who do not have currency incomes. And the payments on these debts, they influenced the whole stability of financial sector. And they also influence the speed of adaptation of economy to current situation and of certain economic sector. Well, as soon as our ruble rates become competitive, it would be okay. Well, I always say that ruble and currency rate balance is equal to currency risk. So if you try to save and take loan in currency, not in rubles, you should understand that you take the currency risk on yourself. And if there are any problem, it will influence you. Well, let's start the second voting. I would love to ask one more question. What is the sure way to protect economy from oil shocks? Floating exchange rate, budget rule, hedging on the market. We will talk about it later on. Well, we'll talk about future selling so that future income inflow is more shaped. It is imposing capital controls. We are discussing it less recently. There is no normal or safe mechanism to protect from oil shocks. I see that people are voting quite enthusiastically. Well, I think that we can talk about the leader in the voting. Thank you, everybody who voted. More than 50%, you talk about budget rule. Please, Vladimir, would you comment on it? In the previous voting, there was no clear leader. But now we see that budget rule stands on the first place. Mr. Degolov talked in his previous speech that Russia is crucially close to Norway, but we do not know if we can follow some strict budget rules. But what is the position of Ministry of Finance? Can you tell us anything about it? Well, I think that Norwegian experience is very important for us. We were doing the same thing in the end of 80s. You've seen it in the video. In 90s, we were spending everything, but it didn't help us. And in 90s, we also were spending a lot. And the crises that taught us to be more cautious with our income. Probably crisis is our basement that will set the trust to the budget rules on the level of policymakers, on the level of society, and we will see that we really need to stick to the rule. Well, I hope that we will not step on the rakes, but Mr. Degolov, I would love to return to you. I would love to discuss this issue in different way. if we talk about economy, should we enhance budget deficit? Should we, especially if we have such monetary policy as we have in Russia? Because central bank recently talked to Minister of Finance, and they told, if you spend more, we will make your expenditures more expensive. And the total effect on economy will not be very positive. Will you agree with this position?
Let's put it like this. I think that, first of all, I think that when we describe the policy of the central bank as tight or are too restrictive, we have to take a step back and realize that the central bank of Russia is a new inflation targeter, or relatively new, that is actually at this point still building credibility. And so we have to remember that in an inflation targeting regime, what really matters most is credibility. Basically, the credibility that people will believe that the central bank will do what is necessary to keep inflation around the target. And so we are in a moment in which maybe there is this perception of tightness of monetary policy, but really what we have to take into consideration is this in mind. That said, of course, it's I think when one talks about coordination between fiscal and monetary policies, it's important to realize that maybe, yes, in a context of a tighter monetary policy, how effective fiscal policy is, maybe less. And the banking sector plays the key role there. Basically, is given fiscal impulse can provide a stronger or lesser impact on the full economy, depending on how the banking sector reacts to this. So the banking sector is there in the center. One thing that I would like to pick up, maybe it's not necessarily completely related to the question, but since we are talking about this and resilience of the economy, vulnerabilities, something that Xenia said before about macro-prudential policies. And I think that this is key, because in the end, what happens in an economy, a commodity-rich economy, like Russia, for instance, or like Norway, when you have a terms of trade shock and the fiscal the budget amplifies this shock, if there is no the fiscal rule, then what you have is that the economy begins completely linked to these terms of trade shock. So actually, quite happy to see the results of this second question, in which most people realize that the first line of defense in a commodity-rich country is the fiscal rule. But then there are other policies, there are a group of policies that are complementing this fiscal rule. That are related first, of course, with macro-prudential policies. They are related to macro-prudential policies at the level of supervision, having a good crisis resolution mechanism. All these policies interact in some way or another to make the economy more resilient to shocks, more resilient to terms of trade shock. And so I think this is, as Xenia mentioned, and fully agree. I mean, in terms of macro-prudential policies, this is relatively new. I mean, countries were implementing macro-prudential policies before the global financial crisis. But really, the debate about macro-prudential policies began together with the global financial crisis and basically with the realization that even if there is this first line of defense, this budget rule, banking sector is prone to procyclical behavior, and so if you want to to protect the economy, to make cycles less pronounced, it's important that in the upswing of economic activity, when you have expansions of economic activity, that these macro-prudential rules kick in to make sure that there are no expansions, there are not undue assumptions of risks. So I guess that going forward and just now focusing for the Russian economy, lots of progress have been done in the last few years, including macro-prudential policies. But this is the time in which Russia should advance into the design and implementation of the policies, into defining who is basically the authority to implement this. Because in the end, if you wait until a new crisis hit, then it's much more complicated during the crisis to begin implementation of these policies.
Спасибо.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Carre, the question to you now. It was not a popular variant, but this practice is used, hedging. The hedging. Shale oil, for example, it is very popular for shale oil. Is hedging a good instrument for Russia, taking into consideration the volume of oil? Shall we have enough of liquidity? Should we use futures or contracts to reduce the risks?
The point that the technological uncertainty or the structural uncertainty is gone. That creates an environment in which it's far safer to hedge than at any other point in time. And the key reason here is that it's a mean reverting market again, very similar to what we saw during the 1980s and 90s. If you think about the 70s, it was a search for a technology, and it was actually the Norwegians who came up with a dominant technology, which was the deep water technology. It was a $20 a barrel technology, and it lasted us up until around 2002. But the key point is it mean reverted to 20. So you took away that structural risk. Hedging became a very viable alternative. So my answer is a resounding absolutely a yes, that countries like Russia should be hedging. And so why? Because in the 2000s, you had that risk that the market would structurally break to the upside, searching for technology. We don't have that anymore. I don't know how long this period is going to last, but at least last another 5 to 10 years with shale being the dominant technology. And so what hedging allows you to do is to take out that cyclical risk, because you don't have the structural risk anymore. And the cyclical risk was what was so devastating in 1998 when you had the Asian financial crisis. So the environment that we're in right now, one, it's a safe environment to hedge because it's likely to be mean reverting around the new technology. And then second, it allows you to take out the cyclical risk. And I'd argue cyclical risks are increasingly getting greater in the current environment. So we'd be very much an advocate of using hedging as a way to manage this type of risk, particularly given the current structural environment with the oil market.
Is there enough liquidity for Russia and Saudi Arabia and et cetera, whoever decides to hedge?
Yeah, we have, the numbers being thrown around are somewhere around, 500 million barrels could be done relatively well. And I think that would be more than sufficient for a large player, because there's very large sovereigns out there that are already very active in these markets. In particular, one that's in the press quite a bit is Mexico, and a very large type of program. So, the ability for producers, whether if it's like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, or the other sovereigns out there, to be able to execute programs in the current environment is very much a realistic possibility.
И вот завершающий вопрос. Вы в начале ответа.
And the last question, you mentioned that now oil OPEC probably should reschedule, rewrite their policy. Probably OPEC's policy should be changed.
We learned is that you have to have a very high level of respect for the velocity of supply coming from the shale producers. And there's a rule in commodity investing, and any agriculture trader knows this, is you don't invest beyond the supply cycle. Now, what do I mean by that? That if I started trading soybeans and corn next season that are not already planted in the ground, meaning that if I bid up soybeans relative to corn and there's no seeds in the ground, what's going to happen? All the farmers are going to go out and plant soybeans relative to corn, and your view will never come true. Before shale, you could trade 2-3 year out oil because be like the Norwegians with their deep water. It'd take 5 years to bring on the supply. Shale is fast cycle. It can be brought on in 14 days. Let me repeat that, 14 days. And on average, it's 3 to 6 months. So let's go our agriculture example here. It's even a shorter supply cycle than agriculture. And I think the mistake here was that the production cuts extended well beyond that supply cycle, and we saw a supply response, and the velocity of that supply response was very significant. So when we think about strategies going forward, is you got to take into consideration how fast that supply cycle is and how fast it will react. And so when we think about strategies of communicating and so forth, if I were implementing one of these strategies, I would do it shock and awe, really quick, not communicate anything to the world, and get out of there. Because one of the mistakes here was that the higher prices that resulted from communicating the production cut led to that velocity of that supply response, because the market traded it further out in the curve. Going back to my example about soybeans versus corn, once the seeds are no longer in the ground, you're safe if the seeds are in the ground. But shale, the seeds are only in the ground maybe 3 months, 6 months at most. And I think that's what I learned. I've been doing this 25 years. This year was one of the biggest learning experiences I've ever seen. And it really is that respect for the velocity of supply for shale.
Что ж, спасибо, господин Хольмсон. Теперь вернемся к примеру Норвегии.
Let's return to Norwegian example and let's talk about your sovereign foundation. All the profit from oil sector comes to this foundation, and all the profits from the investment into this foundation, it is closing to $1 trillion, and it's close to 3 Norwegian GDP. And in Russia, our golden reserves are much smaller, and there were lots of discussion whether we should spend it. We are not investing in the national economy, and so on and so forth. What is the Norwegian philosophy behind the reserve fund being 3 national GDPs?
It's a good question. I'll get back to that. Just first a comment to the questionnaire that you put out. The question that you all responded to was how can we protect a country from the oil price shock? I don't think you actually can protect a country. What we have done is to protect the government's budget, but not the country. I'll explain that. The purpose of fiscal rule is to shelter the government's finances from an oil price shock. And that our system was put to a test in 2014 when the oil price declined sharply. And yes, the system seemed to work. We were actually able to, we did not have to cut back on spending, rather the contrary. We were able to run a counter-cyclical fiscal policy to counter the effects on our economy. But the private sector, and that goes for Norway, it also goes for Russia, because we both have a large oil production sector, and that sector will be hit by an oil price shock. And that's harder to protect against. But of course it helps if public finances are sheltered. What we have done is to set up this large fund, close to 300% of GDP. That fund is invested in stocks and bonds across the world, which means that we have reduced our exposure to oil price risk, but we have increased our exposure to financial market risks. So that's a new volatility that we will have to deal with. And that is, but in a way, it's like spreading the risk is more robust than being only in oil. To your question about the philosophy, well, the philosophy has been quite simple. Given this rule, we will accumulate the whole windfall gain from the oil revenues in this fund. And when we look at the prospect for the outlook for the fund, we're entering a new phase now. The fund has been growing fast over the past 20 years, Now it's going to flatten. We're going to stabilize. So that introduces a new challenge to Norwegian politicians who have gotten used to spend more and more because the spending rule says you can spend 3% of the fund, and it's very easy to stick to the rule when the fund is increasing. Now, when the fund is stabilizing, it's going to be a new day. But let me close by saying, at the end of the day, a spending rule, a fiscal rule, is certainly useful as a benchmark, but it cannot completely solve the problem. I think at the end of the day, the success hinges on politicians are willing to hold back on spending. That's the cornerstone here. Rule can be useful, but it's all about politicians willing to save and hold back. And we have been pretty successful so far, but going forward, it's still going to be a big challenge, even in Norway.
Владимир, вот естественным образом.
Vladimir, now I would love to ask you, it's a logical continuing of our conversation. If you talk about budget imbalance, you can not agree with our idea, but we decided not to cut expenditures ruthlessly. We're waiting to balance revenues and expenditures. And Minister of Finance took serious measures, but we are still mainly in the strategy of waiting. Can you comment on it? And Mr. Holmsen said that it is impossible to protect economy. That was voiced, and the Ministry of Finance voiced it several times. But our budgetary rules are aiming to stabilize macroeconomic situation. Whether it is complied with what we've heard, I will explain you our position. I think our rule is more for stabilization of economy and less for budget. But still, budget is still more stable to oil shock. I will tell you what it was before, and I will explain you how it is going further, what it used to be. We've had budget rule and taxing of oil sector and sensitivity of the rate and all other macroeconomic parameters to oil. It led to the situation that volatility of oil price reflected on non-oil and gas part of economy, though it was well protected. And it is the period of 2012, 2015, 2014, when the rate was pretty strong. But in 2015, the oil price dropped dramatically. The economy of oil projects improved. And we understand what happened to non-oil economy. What we should do to change this situation? Though progressivity of oil taxing stays, but though the oil prices increase, the ruble rate will not react this much. And that means that economy will move with the oil price. But stability of the course will stabilize non-oil sector. And the whole rule is trying to turn the situation when the oil, from the situation when oil sector was protected and non-oil sector was very vulnerable. And now we try to make it vice versa. As for budget, I cannot totally agree. I would say that the budget was tailored. The oil income dropped by more than 4% of GDP. And in 4 years, these revenues due to consolidation we can close. But there is a question, why haven't we done it quickly? Just not to make it that sensitive to the economy. And we've had reserves to prolong this adaptation period. We make this adaptation period 3 years. We took lots of structural measures and we were waiting for better return of state assets. They were pretty complicated solutions on the expenditure side, and that is what Amund mentioned. It is all about political will, whether the policymakers are ready to stabilize it. I would love also to make it clear. Probably the answer is clear, but I would love you to voice it. What is the difference between protecting the non-oil sector of economy from the period when Bank of Russia just had its own corridor and it could have narrowed or stretched this corridor? Well, the difference is, as I mentioned it in the very beginning, between the link of budget parameters and savings. They were not synchronized, and all the interventions on the market, they were not neutral to money aggregates. And if they are not neutral, then we are still sensitive to oil prices. As soon as there is direct link between them, as soon as money aggregates are neutral, then there are other parameters for the inflation.
Ksenia, I would like to ask you the following question about these price changes and rates. Do you believe in stable inflationary targeting, many years of inflationary targeting in the economy or in an economy, in our Russian case, if we had not raised this budget rule, fiscal rule? Do you think there would be a sustainable policy? Or we are still doomed to see some shocks of the balance of payment? You know, there are some countries which do not have budget rules, or formally they may not have this fiscal rule, but they have more or less reasonable budgetary policy with certain fluctuations. Of course, and in this case, the inflation targeting is quite possible. But I will say once again that the goals for inflation have been achieved even without those measures, but still with these measures on board, and now especially thinking forward, we think the situation may be even more volatile. If you think how the science has been developing and the overall ideas about the policies, first there was a concept of the independence of the central bank from wishes of politicians, and then some other momentary needs and decisions. The next discourse was about the budget rule along the same lines, that the whole macroeconomical policy, the fiscal and monetary policy should be made more predictable and more stable, so that eventually we increase the trust of level of trust. And much is said about the interest rates. And speaking of the long-term, well-balanced interest rates, but this is what the budget has impact on and other parameters of the real economy, rather than central bank. Eventually, central bank is somehow changing the short-term interest rates, but overall, it does it around this level, which is defined by different real economy factors. And of course, the central bank also has some impact through the rate of inflation and through the success of hitting the goals for targeting inflations and all that relates to the premium risk. It all depends on the budget policies. I would like to go back. I'm sorry, I would like to go back to the previous question. I've been also asked what are other macro-prudential measures, the counter-cyclical buffer, the standard one, and of course, it can also be utilized at a certain long-term horizon to achieve these goals. Thank you. Are you planning any changes in these policies? Well, all the normative regulations is already in place. It has been functioning, so I guess it's only the question of its right applications and fine-tuning. Ksenia, I would also like to ask you the question. What do you think is the policy of the Bank of Russia is driving to zero any multiplication effect from additional budget expenditures? You know, I'll say once again that these are non-linear connections and processes, and I believe this is not the point at all. If we will take a look at this set of policies and measures that we're discussing today, what it enables us to do, it enables us in the future when we will put it into practice, when we'll have a higher level of trust on the markets, when the expectations will stabilize and so forth, we'll be able to do the counter-cyclical policy in automatic way and more efficiently. I don't quite agree with Vladimir. It's not always the truth that the budget rule is stabilizing economy, and of course the budget is a significant part of the national economy, and if it stabilizes the big chunk of the national economy, and it is stabilization of the economy that we're having impact and effect, not 100% impact, but to a very large degree. And the budget rule, the fiscal rule, not only in some cases it stops us from boosting our public expenses, but in some ways quite the opposite. It stimulates additional expenditures should the economy run into negative shocks, and due to that the economy is balancing itself or basically pursuing the counter-cyclical policies. And the same in the well-balanced situation when you have the good trust level to the policies, to the monetary policies, because we can see it on examples of many countries. In many cases, first of all, inflation correlates with your GDP. If you have the downturn in the economy, your inflation goes down, and what does the central bank does? Do they stimulate both the first and the second? And quite the opposite. We have to understand that what we are doing today will enable us to do very efficient and good counter-cyclical policies in the future. We had been deprived of this opportunity amid very high inflation rates and amid not very well functioning budgetary policies. But if we're speaking about the current situation, then of course this short-term trend by itself, it was a structure shock. It was a shock on the side of the supply, and I think it was very well mentioned here in great detail. And the main measures which are required today to stimulate the national economy, they are belong to this field in terms of it's not so much the budget as the structure of these expenses and other measures related to enhancing our economic potential and making the economy more flexible to move it towards growth. This is actually a very important statement. Let's do the following. Do we have any questions from our audience? Would anybody like to ask our speakers anything? And of course, it would be great if your questions will be directly related to the topic of our today's discussions. Ladies and gentlemen, any questions, please lift up your hand if you have one. Yes, we have the question. Please assist us with the microphone. Would you be so kind to introduce yourself? My name is Alexei Kirillov, Credit Suisse. I would like to ask you about this budget rule, which is in effect in Russian Federation. And now the budget rule is tied up to the two parameters. This is the forex exchange rate, and the ruble-nominated oil price. And many At the beginning of this 2017, many people have noticed that this budget rule, it has a pro-cyclical component to it, which may either stimulate, either speed up the Russian exchange rate, or to make the Russian ruble stronger, maybe excessively strong. Are you planning to change it? If you're planning to change it, then how? And generally, are you satisfied with this mechanism? Thank you, Vladimir. I think some changes have already been put in place, as far as I know. Yeah, thank you for the question. It's actually a very relevant question, but basically we're happy with this situation. We can see that the exchange rate sensitivity against the oil price is decreased. It was negative even. There are many factors playing into that, the flow and outflow of capital, but overall we're happy with the way this mechanism is working. Yes, we know that there are some problems related to identifying the volumes of the operations on the forex exchange market, and the current mechanisms can well be pro-cyclical against flows of capital. And since 2018, this pro-cyclical component will no longer be in existence. The rules will change because there'll be a certain the exchange rate will not have an effect on the volume of operations on the foreign exchange market, but will have the impact on the volume exchange, on the current exchange rate, and any deviations. In fact, the only factor will be the deviations of the current oil prices from the structure level, which is fixed at the $40 plus percentage of inflation. Any other questions, please, if you have any? Good morning. I'm Pavel Kokoy from Sberbank. I have the question for Mr. Holmsen, maybe not exactly related to the topic of our discussion. Can you comment the change of the benchmarks of the Norway sovereign fund, and what can it mean for investments in the debts of the developing countries in the Russian short long-term state bonds? Thank you.
The rule guidelines for the fund is set by the parliament in Norway. But the actual investment decisions rest with the central bank. So the fund is operated by the central bank. Currently, the parliament decided to increase the share of stocks in the index from 62.5% up to 70%. So the rest of the index is bonds, stocks and bonds. Stocks are spread across the world into 77 countries right now, I think. According to market size, and bonds are invested according to GDP size. The reason we now increase the weight on stocks is that the country's total risk has sort of come down as the oil reserves they're not depleted, but they're less than they used to be. So we used to have a large risk exposure to this one commodity. Now that risk is reduced, and then we concluded that we can choose a different mix of risk and expected return. There is, of course, higher expected return on stocks than on bonds. Bonds are extremely expensive these days, so the yield is zero or even negative. So that's the reason. Currently, I think around $5 billion US dollars. At the beginning of this year, $5 billion US dollars were invested in Russia. A little more than half of that was invested in Russian stocks, and a little less than half was invested in Russian government bonds. So that's the current composition. But it's up to the central bank to decide on the exact investments.
Можно вот небольшое уточнение?
Can I be a little bit more specific, asking you a question? The Norway's fund is orienting itself at the real revenue from the instruments, right? It's a real rate of return. This is what the benchmark is all about.
Probably one of the best investments that you can find.
Well, it's true that our spending rule is related to the expected real return from the fund. The guidelines say that we should be invested, it sets up a reference index with stocks and bonds, and the rule or is market size when it comes to stocks. So given the countries that the fund is allowed to invest in, is up to the investor, which is the central bank, to pick the exact stocks and to pick the countries that they want to have in the fund.
Не знаю, уговорили ли мы купить еще немного ОФЗ.
I don't know, maybe we should buy a little bit more short loan bonds in Norway. Maybe we should. Any other questions? Because next we will move to our discussion and there'll be no chances to talk to our speakers. Yes, it looks like we have one more question from Credit Suisse. English or Russian? In Russian, please. And this is my question. As a professional in petroleum market, at the end of the second quarter, there was a big downturn of the shares of the company which are producing oil in the US related to the shale oil production. Companies like Pioneer, they had the reporting, and reading these reportings, you can see that the market is quite optimistic. It's more optimistically thinking about the production of these companies than based on the actual results of these companies. And actually, their shares have slumped, have fallen somewhat. Do you foresee any risks? Has there been any comment in terms of like the more there'll be, the more oil they get with a bigger share of the gas? I mean, are there any risks, and how market is reacting in terms of hedging itself? I mean, how market is making any provisions about this oil production by American shale oil companies? And do you believe that maybe they're overly optimistic about their forecast? Because as far as I understand, this is the main source of the crisis in end of 2017, when the OPEC will be no longer relevant. And is this downturn of the share prices the signal for the market that maybe a market has overestimated this company? Okay, we got the question. Thank you very much.
What we took away from this year is that the market tries to price in the forecast. Part of the reason the oil market went down so sharply in 2Q, because not only the oil market, the equity market, and the credit market all sold off tremendously over that time period. Why? It's because in response to the OPEC production cut in November of last year, the oil forward curve went up to a peak at December, was trading around $57 a barrel against a cost basis of somewhere around 50 to 55. This led to the sharp ramp up in their forecast for production. And as a result, the market sold off. And the one thing that I've taken away, going back to that fast cycle nature of shale, is that the system can adjust to a forecast so fast that the forecast never comes true. Because by the time you got to July, you were at $42 a barrel, the rig count was already coming down, and they were already taking down those forecasts, and the market traded back up again. And so what I take from that is that given how fast cycle this is, that ultimately we're going to get to a point, we're going to go, how much shale do you need? What price do you need to get to that point? And the market's going to go straight to that point. In fact, I know people who trade these markets right now who are now starting to trade a reflexive fundamental balance. And I think that that's what you really take away from it, because it took within 2 to 3 weeks, you flipped to the other side where the market went down, those forecasts were coming down, and the rig counts were coming down, which just goes to how fast this market can respond. And as a result, once you started to bring the rig count, by the time we get to, before the hurricane hit, at least to late August, the market was trading right back up to $50 a barrel. So ultimately, what it's telling you is that given how fast cycle this market is that you ultimately have to back out how much shale does the world need and at what price, and the market needs to go to that level. And so that's what I take away from that experience. But one other point I do want to emphasize here is that if you were to take oil as the baseline, the equity market was trading weaker than the oil price. The credit market was trading stronger than the oil price. And a client said this to me. He goes, you guys have been talking about this new oil order and this competitive environment. And he goes, what are the implications of this new oil order? 1, razor-thin margins. 2, relatively low volatility. And what are those markets telling you? If the equity's trading below the oil market, the credit's trading above the credit market, saying issue more debt and increase those unlevered returns. And I would tend to think there's probably some truth in that statement. But I think the main message to take away from that experience in late 2Q and early 3Q and looking at the rapidity of the adjustment process is that the reflexive nature of these markets now suggests that you really need to incorporate an endogenous price in those forecasts, and I think that really was the mistake. So.
Так, вот теперь уже два желающих. Ну, давайте вот Максиму Петроневичу, если можно, коллеги с микрофоном, вы не могли бы вот туда молодому человеку? И затем к вам потом, да.
And then this person. Good afternoon. My name is Maxim Petronevich, Gazprom Bank. My question to Vladimir and to Mr. Holmesen. As far as I understand, the result of the fact that biggest part of the revenues of oil is put into the Norwegian fund, that means that this expenditure, this revenue does not come to internal currency market. And that's why the volatility of national currency is decreased. And that's why during the past crisis, the Norwegian krone dropped by 30% and Russian ruble two-folds. In Russia, the biggest part of oil export revenues is converted into ruble, and more than 70% of this volume is going to the budget through different taxes, and only the biggest part, the part that is not spent by the ministry, it goes to the currency market. So the question is, what impedes a Minister of Finance from taking the revenues from oil export in currency and convert into ruble the part that is necessary to cover the deficit of budget? I think this will help to decrease ruble volatility. And the second question to Mr. Holmsen, probably I've misheard, but you said that the current budget rule is that 3% from the volume of a fund can go to budget, and it used to be 4%. Why there is such a change? If I understood you correctly, it used to be 4%, now it's 3%. Thank you. Thank you. Vladimir, please first. Well, the experience of the recent years says us that we better take all taxes and all calculations should be in national currency, to make it short. And if we elaborate on this issue, we made all our currency operations very transparent, and the mechanism is very clear and transparent. And if you look at it, you will see that this mechanism is aiming at synchronizing of the flows of payment in rubles and the operations on the current currency market. That's why we tried to synchronize these two flows so that there is no more influence of market, but maximum synchronization that was suggested. It was suggested that we can do the taxes in dollars. Why not? What? It is more reliable to make it in national currency. Mr. Holmsen, the second part, why there was decrease from 4% to 3%? Я хочу ответить и на первую часть вопроса.
Also in Norway, taxes are paid in Norwegian kroner. So the only thing that is not paid in Norwegian kroner is the yields from the government's direct ownership. That yield, which is in dollars, is directly transferred to the central bank into the fund. But the private taxes are paid in Norwegian kroner, which means that the bank, the Norges Bank, is in the market regularly to buy either buy or sell kroner to fill up the gap. And that is done on a very predictable, in a very predictable way. So the bank announces at the beginning of each month how much they're going to do on a daily basis. So that is not regarded as interventions. I think this boils down to what was mentioned before. It's about the credibility of monetary policy. And the reason we had a depreciation of our currency, 2014, 2015, I think that's a result of the way we operate monetary policy, like you do in Russia, like a standard inflation targeting regime, and you get these responses. Then why did we change the rule from 4% to 3%? Well, you know, the fund was actually increasing so rapidly. So we used to have a 4% rule, and we didn't quite live up to the rule. So the actual spending was 2.9, 2.8, 2.5% over the past 3 or 4 years. At the same time, it was evident, it goes without saying, that the expected real return has diminished over the past year. So that was just adapting, you know, the map to the terrain. 3% is today a better estimate of the real return than, well, 4% was the estimate 2001. Today, 3% is the better estimate. And it was relatively easy for us to do the changeover since we already were spending less than 3%. So it's not a dramatic change.
Спасибо. Вопрос, да, остается у вас? Будьте добры, вот микрофон молодому человеку.
Thank you so much. You still have the question? Please give the microphone. Alexei Okholopkov, Khanty-Mansiysk State Pension Fund. I continue the previous question to Mr. Kolochov and Mr. Holmson. As far as I understand, in Russia, the budget rule is aiming budget stabilization, because we understand that economic growth in country is not enough. We still are wanting more of economic growth, and the budget rule is aiming to avoid extra macroeconomic growth. And I'm sure that you have same problem in Norway, because just imagine the threefold GDP is not sent to education or roads. It cannot be just invested in foreign shares, in foreign economies, to make it clear. I think that Norway is afraid that there are not projects in country that can decrease the dependence of economy on oil prices. If you shape, or when you shape the volume of the fund, when you decide on the budget rule, how we evaluate the current budget expenditures and investment budget expenditures into education, into roads, and so on. Because if we know that if oil price drops dramatically, we will not have enough money to pay salaries. So I just want to understand, if we plan to construct bridges, if we do not build bridges, universities, roads, railroads, for example, Norway can construct lots of railroads, but you invested in the fund. Why happens so? Vladimir? You know, the main issue the budget rule does not influence the structure of the expenditures. It does not influence the possibility to invest in certain sector. It only shapes how much we can spend of our expenditures. This is the only way to shape the budget rule. If we need the different structure of expenditures, the budget rule does not impede us from changing it. If we need more of expenditures, we have non-oil We have non-oil revenues, we have non-oil profit. We can try to enhance this volume. We can collect more taxes, or if the society are ready for the increased tax burden, we can reshape it. So it is we mainly talk here about the expenditures, so that we do not see the situation we faced in the 3 last crises. We've seen it in 90s, in the end of 90s, and in 2004. We've seen that we've spent too much of our, let's say, commodity revenues. And Mr. Holmson, if possible, do you know, does Norway have no more its own projects while you are investing abroad only?
No, we have plenty of projects. We have a lot of mountains in Norway, so building roads is extremely expensive, I can tell you, and we build a lot of roads. The important thing is, well, the past couple of years, the yield from the returns from the fund has been greater than the petroleum revenues. So the fund is today a more important industry, in a way, than petroleum. It has been very important to us to invest all these revenues. The revenues are in dollars, so in a way they can only be spent outside the country. It has been extremely important to us that all the revenues are invested abroad. And the domestic priorities, the budget priorities, should be like in any other country. So if we consider building a road, that should be part of the normal budget process where the social return on the road should be evaluated and so on. If we were to take all this money and invest it in Norway, we would clearly overinvest, and we would sort of waste the money. And we would have a lot of inflation. So it has been very important, but I can assure you, since the yields from the fund are so large, we have very high investment rates in roads and hospitals and schools and everything, and it is on a sustainable basis.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you so much. We are already behind the schedule. We're 2 minutes behind schedule. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Thank you so much. At 12, you have plenary session. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.